In the winter of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces faced an impossible dilemma over the skies of Germany. American bomber crews were being slaughtered. Despite flying the most advanced heavy bombers ever built, the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, they were losing aircraft at a rate that threatened to make daylight bombing unsustainable. The problem wasn't the bombers themselves. It was simple mathematics. No Allied fighter could escort them all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe knew this, and they exploited it with ruthless efficiency. German fighters would wait beyond the range of American escorts, then tear into the defenseless bomber formations. But one pilot's unconventional thinking, a gamble that broke regulations and defied conventional wisdom, would transform the P-51 Mustang from a capable fighter into the weapon that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. This innovation didn't come from engineers or generals. It came from a fighter pilot who understood that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to win. This is the story of how external drop tanks doubled the Mustang's combat radius and changed the course of the air war over Europe. October 14, 1943. The date would become known in Army Air Forces history as Black Thursday. The target was Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany, a city whose ball-bearing factories were considered critical to the Nazi war machine. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from English bases that morning. They were escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Spitfires, but only to the German border. Beyond that point, roughly 400 miles from England, the bombers were on their own. The fighters simply didn't have the fuel capacity to go any farther. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Nearly 300 German fighters rose to meet the unescorted American bombers. For the next 3 hours, the B-17 formations endured wave after wave of attacks. FW-190S and BF-109S made frontal attacks, coming head-on at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Some German fighters were equipped with 21-centimeter rockets designed specifically to break up the tight bomber formations. By the time the surviving bombers limped back to England, 60 B-17s had been shot down. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. More than 600 American airmen were dead, wounded, or captured. The loss rate, 26%, was unsustainable. A few more missions like Schweinfurt and the entire daylight bombing campaign would have to be abandoned. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, faced a strategic crisis. Night bombing, as practiced by the RAF, was less accurate. The American doctrine of precision daylight bombing depended on hitting specific industrial targets, and that required bombers to fly in daylight when they were most vulnerable. What the 8th Air Force needed was a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to any target in Germany and still have fuel reserves for combat. In late 1943, no such aircraft existed. The P-51 Mustang was, by any measure, an exceptional aircraft. Designed by North American Aviation in 1940, it combined sleek aerodynamics with the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. At altitude, the P-51B could reach 440 miles per hour, faster than most German fighters. Its laminar flow wing design reduced drag, giving it remarkable efficiency, but in its initial configuration, the P-51B had an internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons, split between fuselage tanks and wing tanks. This gave it a combat radius of approximately 475 miles, better than the P-47 Thunderbolt's 300 miles, but still insufficient to reach Berlin, which required a round trip of over 1,100 miles. The concept of external drop tanks wasn't new. These were expendable fuel tanks mounted under the wings or fuselage that could be jettisoned when empty or when entering combat. The problem was getting pilots to trust them. Military regulations and training doctrine of the era emphasized that external tanks were for ferry flights only, moving aircraft from one base to another. The prevailing wisdom held that drop tanks were dangerous in combat. They created drag, reduced maneuverability, and, most critically, pilots believed they made the aircraft vulnerable if hit by enemy fire. Fighter pilots were trained to drop their external tanks immediately upon sighting enemy aircraft, even if the tanks were still half full. This negated any range advantage they might have provided. Enter Lieutenant Colonel Thomas J. Christian, Jr., commanding officer of the 361 Fighter Group. Christian was an experienced pilot who'd flown combat missions in P-47s. When his unit transitioned to P-51 Mustangs in late 1943, he began studying the aircraft's performance data with an engineer's eye. Christian recognized something that official doctrine had missed. The Mustang's exceptional aerodynamic efficiency meant that external drop tanks imposed far less of a performance penalty than on other fighters. More importantly, he calculated that the tanks themselves weren't the fire hazard pilots feared. They carried fuel, not explosives. A punctured drop tank would leak or tear away. It wouldn't cause a catastrophic explosion. But Christian's real insight was tactical. He understood that the Luftwaffe's strategy depended on intercepting bombers beyond escort range. If Mustangs could penetrate deeper into Germany with external tanks still attached, they could maintain formation with the bombers and engage German fighters on more favorable terms. In January 1944, Christian issued orders that would have gotten him court-martialed if they'd failed. His pilots were to retain their drop tanks until absolutely necessary, even when engaging enemy aircraft. If a dogfight developed, they could jettison the tanks then. But the mere presence of American fighters deep over Germany would force the Luftwaffe to change their tactics. The 361st Fighter Group began flying escort missions with two 108-gallon drop tanks under each Mustang's wings. This increased total fuel capacity from 269 gallons to 485 gallons, an 80% increase. With careful fuel management and cruise climb techniques, this gave the P-51B a combat radius exceeding 850 miles. On March 4, 1944, Christian's gamble paid off spectacularly. His fighters escorted B-17s all the way to Berlin, the first time American fighters had reached the German capital. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was immense. Suddenly, there was no sanctuary. American bombers could strike anywhere in Germany with fighter escort. Other fighter groups quickly adopted Christian's tactics. By spring 1944, standard operating procedure called for Mustangs to carry drop tanks deep into enemy territory. Pilots learned to fight with the tanks still attached if necessary, though they preferred to drop them before violent maneuvering. The numbers tell the story. In the 6 months before widespread adoption of long-range drop tank tactics, July through December 1943, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 176 heavy bombers per month. In the 6 months after, January through June 1944, losses dropped to an average of 126 bombers per month, despite a massive increase in the number of missions flown. But the real impact was on the Luftwaffe. German fighter losses skyrocketed. Previously, Luftwaffe pilots could choose when and where to engage, hitting bombers at their most vulnerable points. Now they faced aggressive American fighters throughout their airspace. Even more devastating was the Mustang's ability to strafe Luftwaffe airfields, catching German fighters during takeoff and landing, their most vulnerable moments. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was a spent force. Allied bombers and fighters operated over Normandy with near impunity. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks and flown by pilots who'd learned to maximize their range, had achieved what many thought impossible. They'd won air superiority over Nazi Germany. The innovation didn't stop with wing-mounted tanks. Engineers developed a 110-gallon centerline drop tank that mounted on the fuselage belly. With this and two wing tanks, a P-51D could carry an additional 324 gallons, more than doubling its internal capacity. This extended combat radius to over 1,000 miles, allowing Mustangs to escort bombers to any target in German-occupied Europe and return home. Colonel Christian's willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and test his theories under combat conditions had proven decisive. The drop tank gamble worked not just because of the Mustang's engineering excellence, but because one officer understood that sometimes the greatest weapon is the courage to break the rules when they no longer serve their purpose. Today, P-51 Mustangs grace air shows and museums around the world. Many still wear the wing-mounted drop tanks that once carried them deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. These simple aluminum cylinders, disposable, unglamorous, and often overlooked, represent one of the war's most significant tactical innovations. The lesson of the drop tank gamble extends beyond World War II. It reminds us that equipment is only as effective as the doctrine that governs its use. The P-51 Mustang was always capable of long-range escort duty. It just needed someone willing to challenge the assumption that it couldn't be done. Thomas Christian's innovation saved thousands of bomber crewmen's lives and helped break the Luftwaffe's grip on European skies. It proved that in warfare, as in life, sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not from building something new, but from using what you already have in ways nobody thought possible. The drop tank gamble changed the air war, and in doing so, it changed history.